Order!
Tabe yakala betsene kuntikala nesi dakakont ende sezus kwete ayuna neso tukte likumenik etene kuti kitiga ayuna tenona taukekwe ayuna neso ko akiniwe uti ko tsena neti ko hevoneta ko nena utse hinto tsontanike ko tsontanike kala ayuna ko sanoki akitida uti se Jesus in wetsene ko tsena neti ehtsone kolana thoda sonne ayuna jokiri ko karintin ana so ehlekute neso ehlekirufcha masi atabe yakala betsene kuntikala nesi dakakont ende.
Please be seated. Thank you to Elder Sarah Cleary for offering today's prayer. Colleagues, it's my pleasure to welcome you all back to the chamber to resume the third session of the 18th Legislative Assembly. I'd like to begin by recognizing the pages this session who will come from Fort Smith, Norman Wells, and Yellowknife. Welcome and thank you to the pages. It is our privilege to share this chamber with these young people and our future leaders. Please join me in thanking them and welcoming them to the Assembly. Our Assembly was recently home to another group of future leaders, the participants in the annual Youth Parliament. Thank you to all the youth who participated and to all those who worked hard behind the scenes to make the event a success. Colleagues, I wish to highlight the participation of young women in Youth Parliament. As an Assembly, we have set a goal of increasing the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly. In our Youth Parliament, more than 80% of the members were women, and all members of Cabinet were women. I hope that this is a sign that our call for more women to sit in the Assembly has been heard, and that one day these young women will return to this chamber as members. I would like to advise members of this House and the public that throughout the sitting we will be providing interpretation in the following languages: Tlicho, Chippewan, French, and North Slavey. I want to thank our interpreters for their work in making our proceedings available in our official languages. Merci. For members who wish to listen in English, please remember to leave your dials on Channel 2. Finally, colleagues, I would like to welcome to the floor of the House Mr. Glenn Rutland. Mr. Rutland is no stranger to this Assembly. He has spent many hours in this chamber as a law clerk, but today is his first day on the floor in his new role, Deputy Clerk, Procedure and Committees. Welcome, Mr. Rutland. Merci, colleagues. Orders of the day. Item 2, Minister Statements. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I have two minister statements, one short and one longer. Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise members that the Honourable Glenn Abernathy will be absent from the House today to attend the Seniors FPT meetings in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome all members back to the continuation of the third session of the 18th Legislative Assembly. As we near the end of our term, our government continues to focus on advancing the priorities of the Assembly and fulfilling remaining mandate items. These are intended to help create a better future for all residents of the Northwest Territories, including the advancement of outstanding claims and self-government negotiations. For almost 4 years, Mr. Speaker, our government has put a great deal of effort into raising the profile of the Northwest Territories at the national level. Our territory does not exist in isolation, and the choices and decisions of other governments in neighboring provinces and territories and at the federal level can have a significant impact on what happens here at home. Last week, I was in Ottawa with Cleacho Grand Chief George McKenzie to appear before the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs in support of Bill C-88. This bill seeks to advance numerous amendments to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. These were first passed as part of the federal legislation that established devolution and include the continuation of regional land and water boards as established in the land claims. Passage of this bill will help ensure our residents have the tools and legislative authority needed to effectively make decisions about responsible resource development and increased certainty. Coming together to speak up on behalf of the Northwest Territories when important decisions like this are pending is one way we are having a real impact on national affairs. We have been successful at putting the Northwest Territories on the national agenda and leveraging that attention for investments in territorial priorities throughout the term of this Assembly. Most recently, that has included commitments in the last federal budget to invest $18 million over 3 years in the Tulsan Hydro Expansion Project and $5.1 million for planning and surveys to support the development of the Slave Geological Province Corridor. Effective cooperation and partnerships with our provincial and territorial counterparts has been another important part of how we have placed and kept the North on the national agenda. My colleagues on the Council of Federation were particularly effective, for instance, in helping secure special recognition for the unique challenges that the three northern territories face as part of the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. Mr. Speaker, while we have achieved a lot, we cannot take our achievements for granted. Recent months have seen significant turnover among premiers across the country, and we are all aware that there is a federal election this fall. In this climate of change, it will be more important than ever to educate and engage governments at all levels so we can ensure the North continues to be a priority on the national agenda. But our efforts should not end there. We also need to start thinking globally, not just nationally. The Arctic has always been an important symbol for Canada, a geographic statement of our place and status in the world as a northern power. Unfortunately, Canada's interest in and attention to the Arctic has often been symbolic at best. Generations of Southern Canadians and their governments have grown used to thinking of the North as a vast and inaccessible place valued most for its emptiness. This, however, is not a view of the Arctic shared by other nations. In recent years, I have spent a great deal of time making connections with other leaders and promoting the Northwest Territories. I can tell you from the conversations that I have been having that interest in the North, in the Arctic, is immense. Canada is alone when it comes to inaction in the Arctic. China and Russia, for instance, see enormous opportunity in the Arctic. They are moving fast to ramp up their presence and level of activity within their borders and across the circumpolar world. This is an effort to both secure opportunities for themselves and to influence the international rules and policies that will set the terms for what happens in the Arctic. Russia sees the Northern Sea Route as an essential maritime opening for its country. Russia has a fleet of 20 icebreakers capable of traversing the Northern Sea Route more than a dozen ports, including 2 deep water ports in the Arctic, and have committed to increasing investments to attract more shipping traffic through the Northern Sea Route. China released a white paper on its Arctic strategy last year, is investing heavily in infrastructure around the world, and certainly has its eye on Arctic shipping and research. They were recently in discussions with Greenland about investing in 3 airport projects and have their own nuclear icebreaker under construction. They have 1 polar research vessel in service and a second one expected to enter service this year. Despite the 1998 agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of the United States of America on Arctic cooperation, the United States has started to renew assertions that the Northwest Passage is an international waterway rather than internal Canadian waters. New legislation proposed by Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, the Arctic Policy Act, and the Shipping and Environmental Leadership Act may be seen as a renewed will in the United States to set the terms for the Arctic. Mr. Speaker, in the face of this international activity, I think it only makes sense to ask, where is Canada? Does Canada want to remain a leader in the Arctic? What is Canada's vision for the Arctic? What is Canada prepared to do to make sure it has a real say in setting the terms of engagement for all nations? I also think it makes sense that residents of Canada's 3 northern territories have a leading say in determining Canada's plan for the Arctic. We are the ones who live here. We are the ones who are repeatedly affected when decisions are made for us rather than with us. We are an obvious partner for Canada when they begin to discuss what should happen next. As international interest and activity in the Arctic accelerates, it is important that Canada is not left behind. There are some clear areas where Canada can concentrate its focus and attention. Positioning Canada's northern territories as a hub for trade and transportation is one of these. The circumpolar route can cut as much as 20 days off the time it takes to reach Asia from Europe via ship. Other countries know this, and they already have been making moves to secure control over these routes, both through their active use and by advancing claims over their status as national or international channels. Canada's north is closer to key markets in all the major global trading blocs, including Europe, Asia, and Russia, than most other regions of North America. It would be a shorter trip from Yellowknife to Moscow than it would be from Toronto. We're also closer to European centers like Stockholm, Oslo, Copenhagen, and Helsinki. Heading east, a 10,000-kilometer plus trip from Toronto to Tokyo or Beijing would be less than 8,000 kilometers from Yellowknife. Mr. Speaker, Canada should be leveraging this comparative proximity to these international markets and investing significantly in transportation infrastructure in all 3 northern territories. Growing and expanding territorial airports can make them a major transshipment point for goods moving between Asia, North America, and Europe, especially if there is supporting investment in connecting infrastructure like roads and railways linking us to southern Canada. Similarly, investments in deep water ports and marine facilities along Canada's Arctic coast can help to capture trade already traveling the polar route, and which is sure to increase in coming years, as well as tourist and scientific traffic that is also sure to grow. Another area Canada will need to look at as it considers what it wants to achieve in the Arctic in coming years is its physical presence. Simply put, Canada needs to be in the Arctic if it wants to have a say in what happens in the Arctic. Economics are driven and sustained by people, and Canada is very much lagging in this regard. It is hard to achieve the economies of scale that can truly drive growth and prosperity when our population is a sliver of the population in the rest of the circumpolar world. Our small population also limits our ability to effectively monitor activity in the Arctic. How effectively can Canada monitor the Arctic coastline and shipping passages with only a single Coast Guard station in Iqaluit and search and rescue resources located at southern military bases? How long will it take Canada to even learn of a maritime or environmental incident and then effectively respond to and manage it? What effect would such a delay have on the Arctic, its people, and its environment? Finally, Canada needs to know the Arctic, Mr. Speaker, not just know about it. If it wants to have a meaningful say in decisions about the Arctic in coming decades. As a northern nation, Canada should make it a priority to ensure that more of its citizens have an opportunity to experience the Arctic and learn what it really means to be northern. Policy and decision makers need to have experience in and understand the territories where they can gain the direct, first-hand knowledge and experience to make good, evidence-based decisions. Knowing the Arctic also means significantly ramping up Canada's scientific research capacity and Arctic academic infrastructure. If Canada wants to understand how climate change affects the North and how to adapt to it, we need significant investment in scientific research programs and facilities to support that. If we want thriving territorial economies, it also makes sense to educate the next generation of business and civic leaders here, including professionals like doctors and lawyers who will support communities. Mr. Speaker, we must lead the conversation to determine what Canada wants for the Arctic. We must also lead the conversations about establishing and implementing Canada's Arctic priorities. As the world attention continues to shift towards the actions and politics of the circumpolar North, Canada's need for a meaningful Arctic plan is only going to become more important. With the Arctic figuring ever more prominently in the plans of other global powers, we need to know that Canada has a plan. Territorial residents will need to be confident that their priorities are found in this plan and that it will benefit them. Northerners, setting the term for the North has been a significant priority for the government of Northwest Territories for years. Devolution was all about Northerners being able to make their own decisions about how the land, environment, and resources of the Northwest Territories are managed. Mr. Speaker, our government continues to pursue this priority in the 18th Legislative Assembly with a number of proposed bills that improve on the legislative authorities for managing land and resources that were transferred from Canada at the time of devolution. These include the Mineral Resources Act, Environmental Rights Act, Protected Areas Act, Public Lands Act, Petroleum Resources Act, Oil and Gas Operations Act, and Environmental Rights Act. Defining the future of the Arctic and Canada's 3 northern territories will require a bold vision and an ambitious plan. Mr. Speaker, Northerners need to have a role in shaping that plan. The upcoming federal and territorial elections provide us with an opportunity to continue a broad conversation about the long-term future of the North. This work to advocate for the people of the territory will build on what we have achieved during the life of this Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to continuing that advocacy and to working with all members in our remaining months here to help make the North a priority for Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the statement from the Premier. Mine is very similar. Mr. Speaker, Europeans started looking at the Northwest Passage in the 19th century. Explorers and their governments thought it would be a shorter route for ports of trade in Asia. Mr. Speaker, no thought was given to the indigenous people who had been living in the Arctic coast long before time was recorded. The state of mind still exists today. At the Arctic Council ministerial meeting in Finland earlier this month, American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a speech where he said the United States has a long-standing feud with Canada over our legitimate sovereign claims to the Northwest Passage. This statement may have opened up the Arctic more so than ever before for activity that we are not prepared for environmentally, socially, or infrastructure-wise. More vessels and cruise ships are traveling through the passage in the summer months, and this is increasing, making this a major issue for many reasons. The Polar Code came into force in 2017, which is mandatory for all ships operating in the Arctic with the intent to protect the unique environment and ecosystems of the Arctic. Mr. Speaker, the development of marine passageways, trade, and other activity will have major impact on the Inuit way of life. Climate change is already having a drastic effect on the Arctic environment, including the Inuvialuit and the wildlife. If the Northwest Passage is made international waters, there are no controls over who may traverse this sensitive ecological area. The damage to the environment that sustains us will be certain and immediate. Mr. Speaker, there is much risk to the lands, waters, and animals that are central to our way of life. Unregulated marine traffic through the passage will irrevocably change both environment and Inuit who rely upon it. Mr. Speaker, other countries are rapidly expanding their presence in the Arctic. Russia is building more than 15 deep water ports along their Arctic coast and icebreakers to navigate their waterways. China refers to itself as a near-Arctic country, and a few months ago announced it would be building a nuclear-powered icebreaker that is bigger than Russia's largest icebreaker. Mr. Speaker, our infrastructure is eroding almost as fast as we build it. Canadian ships can't make it through the heavy sea ice. Our sovereignty is being ignored, which will have profound implications for Inuit and all Canadians in years to come. Mr. Speaker, we must encourage our Indigenous, our territorial, and our national governments to work together, especially where our priorities align. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Assembly for our spring session. Mr. Speaker, one of the communities in my riding of the Mackenzie Delta, Fort McPherson, is situated right along the Peel River. The Peel River ice reports state that the ice first started moving on Monday of last week and was clear last Thursday. Mr. Speaker, the ice conditions in Sigachik reports say that the Red River is clear and the Mackenzie ice is thinning and the water levels are quite low. At the end of April, both ice crossings on the Peel and Mackenzie Rivers closed for the season. I've been on record stating that the extreme cost of food, gas, heating, fuel increases with isolation. Mr. Speaker, our people suffer with high cost of food. Hunters who want to gather ducks and geese have to burden the high cost of gasoline. Although the warm weather is upon us, there are days when we still need to adjust our furnace thermostats to keep our homes heated. Also, one of our businesses in Fort McPherson is out of gasoline due to the ice conditions this spring. Mr. Speaker, with the Peel River clear of ice and debris, community members are excited the Abraham Francis Ferry will be launched in the Peel sooner than later. The Mackenzie River also connects to the Inuvik-to-Tuk Highway, and it's important to note that last summer we had record numbers of tours to the region. The faster we get both ferries operational, food prices will decrease and tourists will take advantage of the early season and come north. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have questions later today.
Thank you. Member statements. Member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you spoke eloquently about youth in your opening comments. The question is, what should we be doing for Northern youth so they are supported in ways that allow them to flourish? A recent Conference Board of Canada report identified youth as one of the three key areas of Northern policy. As a society that will depend on our youth in the future, we need to help and support our young people. We know they face disproportionate challenges growing up, educational and cultural, economic and social, but we also know our youth are strong, intelligent, capable and resilient. Support for young people will help them, their families and Northern society overall. Mr. Speaker, we must lead the way with public policy initiatives that will create positive outcomes for young people. A strong sense of cultural identity and belonging builds strength and independence amongst young people as they navigate a changing world. Land-based cultural programs in all grades, like the one founded at Degas School in Fort Providence, lead to young adults who are better adjusted to confront life's challenges. Community-based healing is consistent with the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A whole community approach to wellness will build resilience and nurture youth. Traditional healing practices and healthy coping mechanisms encourage and support resilience, leadership, and personal achievement. We must encourage youth participation in public dialogue and decision-making. Civic engagement and youth leadership at all levels will support youth to become role models for their younger peers and help build community relationships, positivity, and trust. Mr. Speaker, our youth will come through if provided the chance, but it's on us to create the framework where that can happen. For them to succeed, we need a growing economy that provides opportunity. We need affordable housing and reasonable cost of living. We need educational opportunities that encourage them to be doctors, electricians, or traditional harvesters as they choose. And of course, they need a clean and protected environment that enables them to thrive. Mr. Speaker, saying the youth are our future is true, but it isn't enough. We owe our young people concrete action that will make their world a place of opportunity. Let's support our youth in every way possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member statements. Member for Tuneta-Williday.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 1974, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation was formed, and one of the principles in forming the Housing Corporation was to develop markets in the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, funded the capital construction costs of new public housing either 90% or 75%, depending on the section which the units were built under. In addition, CMHC paid for 75 or 50% of the operating costs and the mortgage costs, until the CMHC mortgage of 25 to 35 years was paid off. At that time, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation would make the houses available for home ownership. The houses would be priced based on what the market could bear in each community. An example would be that if the N.W.T. Housing Corporation divested a house in a strong market like Yellowknife, where the house could be sold at the appraised market value. However, in communities where no market or very little market exists, the house could be discounted to what the market could bear. In communities where no market exists, the house could be transferred to the new homeowner for a nominal amount or even $1. When the units are transferred to home ownership, the operational and maintenance costs of those units will no longer be the responsibility of the taxpayers or the government. Mr. Speaker, the current system allows the N.W.T. Housing Corporation to retain all its public housing units and continue to keep public housing tenants within the G&W.T. social net. However, if the N.W.T. Housing Corporation was to divest themselves of the houses, the cost of the entire social housing system would be reduced substantially and markets would be developed in other communities. People that own their own homes are more apt to maintain their properties, which would benefit all residents of that community. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation must move on this initiative as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, if we keep doing the same thing over and over, there will be no community housing development, and the cost to the G&W.T. will continue to grow. The core need will also continue to increase across the entire N.W.T. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member statements. Member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Welcome back, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, this past April the 10th, 2019, the SATU Secretariat Incorporated and the Government of Northwest Territories, the Department of Infrastructure, signed a milestone MOU in Norman Wells to engage collaboratively for the Mackenzie Valley Highway environmental assessment, a commemorative day for the quest to an all-weather road connection. Mr. Speaker, this partnership presents yet another unique opportunity, an opportunity for the Toledo youth community to appoint a representative to actively witness and experience the N.W.T regulatory system on a mega project such as the application to connect Fort Wrigley to Norman Wells, a corridor of 330 kilometers. Mr. Speaker, it is not often an opportunity of this experience presents itself on public engagement process to experience the early stages of superior projects such as the Mackenzie Valley Highway and the public involvement. Mr. Speaker, should our government support this initiative, engagement sessions in the impacted right-of-way communities during the process would certainly allow our public to better understand the true meaning of engagement supported by this government by the attendance of a youth representative. Mr. Speaker, the experiences captured by the youth during this process would be outstanding. Imagine carrying on the Mackenzie Valley Highway from the initial days of John Diefenbaker in today's regulatory and land claim systems. Mr. Speaker, later I will have questions to the appropriate minister. Masi.
Thank you. Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, several weeks ago I was informed by members of the public that alcohol prices for bars and restaurants has significantly increased. The changes the government made has caused nearly a 20% increase in the cost of some products to our hospitality sector in a single day. This increase in costs would have made it near impossible for our hospitality sector to survive without passing along increased price to consumers. Now, Mr. Speaker, a discount program has been authorized and the cost to northern businesses has been reduced somewhat. But this did not occur until the public and regular members created substantial pushback. I, like many members of the public, are extremely disappointed with what has happened, and I have asked for the minister to review the price formula to ensure that fair market principles apply to our liquor wholesaling system. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, this issue is not about cheap alcohol. It's about mitigating toxic pricing for our hospitality industry, protecting jobs and northern businesses. I do not believe that these price increases were brought on wholly by the federal excise tax and transportation costs, as has been claimed. These were factors, certainly, but if they were true, then the prices would have increased equally in all parts of the country, and that has not happened. The price structure that currently exists in the Northwest Territories needs to be rebalanced to ensure fair market access. This should have been done ahead of any changes to avoid the exact situation licensees found themselves in on April 1st. The most concerning part about this whole debacle is that there was very little communication from the Liquor Commission to license holders. I would wonder how moving forward we might avoid another confusing and stumbling out rollout of program changes. In a time where Alberta and British Columbia have also loosened central control over retail liquor sales, in Ontario, the largest government-owned liquor system in Canada, is well on its way to hand off its system to the private sector. I believe now is the time for the N.W.T to re-evaluate its role and its hold on alcohol sales. The minister is committed to a pricing review, but we must now take this opportunity to go beyond and make positive changes to our antiquated liquor control system while empowering Northerners to make healthy choices and embrace our inherent personal freedoms to consume alcohol safely and responsibly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Good afternoon, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to offer my reflections on the Housing Summit hosted by the N.W.T. Housing Corporation in Inuvik last month. I appreciate the invitation to attend. The summit confirmed several key points, most of which were long known. First, there is a shortage of social housing in most communities. The waiting lists are long, especially for single people, and they may spend years waiting for a place to live. The Housing Corporation is unable to keep up with the demand. Second, there are some significant barriers to attracting tenants to home ownership. Most tenants have lower than average income that does not stretch far enough for high power and fuel prices and exorbitant insurance costs in small communities. Third, housing is often designed, situated, and regulated without input from community members. Mr. Speaker, there is a ray of hope, and that is the Community Housing Support Initiative. This program helps communities help themselves by funding projects that are jointly developed by local governments and the Housing Corporation. The program is flexible enough that the local government can combine it with other GNWT programs to pay the cost of labor, for example. This program has the potential to deliver benefits to more communities, but it needs increased investment by the Housing Corporation to make it more widely available. Trickling in 3 or 4 new houses a year is obviously just not enough. It will never catch up. While there was some agreement on issues, there's still some uncertainty about solutions. The Housing Corporation continues to promote home ownership despite pushback on costs. Historically, few people have taken up this opportunity. People who get into social housing tend to stay there as renters. There's very little movement because people fear that if they move, they'll lose their housing and start over with the waiting list. Mr. Speaker, housing is the basis of social health. Without adequate housing, all other efforts at improving social conditions are hampered. In the mandate for this Assembly, we agreed to increase the availability of safe, affordable housing. Given what we heard in Inuvik, we are not there yet. We are not even close. The Housing Corporation committed to developing a plan to go with the new federal housing strategy dollars that will lead the way, and I look forward to seeing it. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. On May 1st, CBC ran a story about how renovations to the main baggage screening area at the Yellowknife Airport would cause delays in passenger boarding. The Department of Infrastructure was quoted as saying passengers needed to arrive at check-in 90 minutes before flight time instead of the usual 60. There was no GNWT media release, and no other media outlets carried this story that day. 2 days later, in the May 3rd Yellowknifer, there was a 2-inch story, and the Yellowknife Airport Authority ran an ad telling people to arrive at the airport 30 minutes earlier to avoid missing flights. That's a good start to alert newspaper readers, but that ad only appeared once. On May 9, the Infrastructure Minister's Office put out an email to all MLAs confirming the baggage area work had begun on May the 1st and the need to arrive 90 minutes before flight time. Finally, on May 10th, 10 days after the 90-minute check-in warning went into effect, the Infrastructure Department issued a news release confirming the additional time needed to get on flights with checked baggage. Even though today, if you go on the Yellowknife Airport website, there is no notice of a 90-minute early arrival requirement. In attempting a scan of commercial airline departure information sites, I can find no notice of a 90-minute warning. There's no mention of this on the Yellowknife Airport Facebook page either. What's going on? The Yellowknife Airport is the primary transportation portal for all personal, business, tourism, and other travelers to and from Yellowknife. So this is pretty important news. Get there 30 minutes early or you could miss your flight. When you have a change in conditions of a core transportation system, a change that could lead to paying passengers missing their flights, you probably want to make sure that the news gets out early, widely, and repeatedly. Later today, I'll ask the Minister to explain what went wrong and how we can do better in the future. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member statements. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, ka imbe
Yes, there is a lot of things that's happening within this area. a lot of things like ships and that are handling. Maybe sometimes we think we've got to look at this thing.
Thanks to the quick actions taken by Chris Chico, Melaine Simba, and Ryan Moore in the Fort Providence RCMP detachment, there were no fatalities, and the 3 boaters were rescued after clinging to their overturned boat for 3 hours. Chief Lloyd Chico of the Untitled First Nation says that boating accidents happen too often around his community. The public needs to practice safety and awareness of the environment and pay attention to weather conditions. Local residents can be employed as guides, if all possible, as the lake bed can be shallow in places and choppy water is not uncommon. Mr. Speaker, I grew up on the river, and my earliest memory is traveling with my parents in a canvas boat. Paying the water with tobacco was a common practice to pay homage to the laws of nature. In addition to respecting our land and water, remember to practice safety and on the land smarts. Always wear a life jacket. Inform relatives or friends of your travel plans. Equip yourself with an emergency communication device such as Spot, or as simple as a whistle. Keep an eye out for weather conditions, and above all, respect the land. This government offers small vessel training, and I encourage residents to take it when it is offered. According to recent statistics, fewer people are drowning in the N.W.T than 10 years ago. We must keep this trend going on, teach water safety to children so they know how to play safely in and near lakes and rivers. Enroll them in swimming lessons if they are offered in your community. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to personally thank Chris Chico, Melaine Simba, Ryan Moore, and the Fort Providence RCMP detachment for their quick response. Good job, and Masi Cho. Mr. Speaker, we had a close call this month, but thankfully it ended with everyone safe. Let's make sure everyone stays safe on the water this summer. Masi, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Percy Samuel Hardesty left behind an incredible legacy of family, humor, love, and friendship. Percy Hardesty was born in Wrigley, N.W.T. on July 9, 1951, to Arthur and Christina Hardesty. He was the youngest of 3 boys and a big brother to his youngest sister. He is survived by his sister Doreen and his brother Charles. Percy attended school in Fort Simpson in Yellowknife. Upon completing school, Percy served in the Canadian Armed Forces for 5 years of admirable services. After serving our country, he went on to work in the oil industry in Alberta. In 1977, Percy returned to Fort Simpson and Wrigley. Percy fondly speaks about moving back to Fort Simpson. First, he was saved by the Lord around that time, attending a gospel tent meeting in the Thomas Simpson schoolyard. He remained deeply religious for the remainder of his life. Second was meeting the love of his life, Elizabeth Menikosh. On February 16, 1985, they were married and raised 3 wonderful daughters. During his life, he had a number of jobs working with Parks Canada, the Recreation Centre, the Fort Providence Residential School Society, and serving on the executive committee of the Detroit First Nation. As well, he owned his own businesses doing seismic slashing and security services. He was always busy. Percy worked hard to serve his people in the Detroit in many different capacities. He served 2 terms as chief of Wrigley, first in 1985 and 2000. He was one of the founding directors of the Detroit Friendship Center in Fort Simpson and served 12 years as the chairperson. He was awarded for all his hard work with the Queen's Elizabeth II Golden Jamboree Medal in 2002 for outstanding exemplary contribution to their community or Canada as a whole. Percy Hardesty served on the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Review Board from November 2003 until August 2004, where he took a leave of absence to serve on the Joint Review Panel member for the Mackenzie Gas Project for 7 years. After finishing the project was completed, he returned to the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Board December 2009. He concluded his service to the board in March 2014. Mr. Speaker, as Percy was nearing the end of his journey, lying on his bed, his pain and discomfort disappearing, all at once he stopped breathing. Embraced by his family and friends by his bedside, softly and silently, he left them as he went to meet the Lord on April 17th. The Hardesty family would like to thank everybody for their loving support and prayers during their time of sorrow. As well, I'd like to thank Kevin Medicosh for doing the eulogy. Mr. Speaker, Percy Samuel Hardesty will be sadly missed and never forgotten.
Our condolences go out to the family. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm very pleased to recognize my wife, Judy, in the gallery. Her presence always brightens up the chamber. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize my wife, Anne, who is in the gallery with family friend Jim Mumferson.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. The member for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Mr. Speaker, the sun is shining very brightly today, and I'd like to recognize one of my constituents, Judy McLeod. It's always a pleasure to see you here at the Legislative Assembly and supporting our deputy premier, and also would like to take an opportunity to recognize Jimmy Kalenic, who's been doing who's been a very strong supporter of cultural and traditional programs in Inuvik, but also has started up a very strong tourism operation with the Inuvik-Tuk Highway opening up. So welcome, Judy. Welcome, Jimmy.
Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. I want to welcome everyone who joined us today. It's always great to see people participating, or at least observing our democracy in action. And I want to welcome everyone who's watching online, on satellite, in the Northwest Territories and around the world. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier I made a statement about sovereignty in the Arctic, and the Premier's sessional statement reflected a lot of what we're trying to focus on, in especially in our Arctic regions where there's a lack of infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, my questions to the Premier is, can the Premier update the House on any discussions he's had with the federal government on Arctic sovereignty? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member has raised, and I spoke to in my statement, Canada needs to take action in the Arctic, and our governments and people lead this dialogue. The best way for Canada to show its commitment to its Arctic is through significant investment in its people, economies, science, and infrastructure. I've been clear to the federal government about the need for this investment. I have been clear that northern voices need to be heard. I have also specifically spoken to the need for investment in support of the safety and security of our borders and people. And I'm pleased to say that we've had some positive signals from Canada in this area, in particular related to investments in infrastructure and cleaner, more affordable energy for the territory, and in the development and moving forward with Bill C-88 and negotiations related to the offshore. There's also been the creation of an Arctic region for the Coast Guard. However, as made clear in my statement today, there is need to do much more. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to hear that the Premier and the Governor of Northwest Territories are working with the federal counterparts. We talk about climate change a lot, and I know I have during this assembly in the last 3.5 years. But you know, one of the things is infrastructure and action by our federal counterparts. Mr. Speaker, my second question is, has the Government of Northwest Territories partnered with any of our Indigenous governments on efforts to promote sovereignty in the Arctic regions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member noted in his statement, the Arctic has been home to Indigenous people long before it was ever traversed by European explorers. The people of the Canadian Arctic are Canada's Arctic sovereignty. Therefore, the work of Indigenous governments and the Government of Northwest Territories is supporting sovereignty on a daily basis. By working to keep the Indigenous cultures and languages in the territory vibrant, we are demonstrating sovereignty. We also demonstrate sovereignty by working to strengthen communities, build wellness, and create opportunities for prosperity. And as the climatic and geopolitical realities in the Arctic continue to shift, it is the federal government that now must step up to the plate and work with the people of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions, member for N.W.T.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't have much more. I appreciate the response from the Premier, and I'm afraid with earlier in my sessional statement that my member statement that with the announcement of countries like the United States calling on China and Russia, it opens up the doors as a start of a race. So that's one of the things that concern me, and I think it needs for us to work together. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question is: would the Premier be willing to tour my riding with representatives possibly from the Untitled Regional Corporation as well as with the MP of the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we're committed to holding cabinet open houses in each riding, and we'll work with the member to ensure these take place before the end of the 18th Assembly. And I would be pleased to have all three levels of government present in his riding if the member from N.W.T. would like to invite the Member of Parliament and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation into his riding at the same time as the Cabinet open house. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow-up to my member statement, I have a few questions for the Minister of Infrastructure. I'd like to ask the Minister, have all the inspections been done on both ferries to ensure they can be launched as soon as possible? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The staff are out there working and doing their due diligence. I'd have to get back to the member on the exact timing that Transport Canada would be in there to do their stuff. But from my indication, what I've got from the department so far is that we're on schedule to have both the Louis Cardinal and the Abraham Francis ferries in the water and operational by next week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these inspections have never been an issue in the past. Is it because of increased changes to the inspections, or what's causing these delays with these inspections? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not aware of being any delays on this. We are historically had these ferries in by June 2nd, so I believe we're on schedule. But as I said, I can check into the Transport Canada inspection issue and see if there is an issue and relay that to the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the ferries be in operation earlier this year compared to previous years? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, historically, these are on average have been in place by June 2nd, so if we have them in by next week, we could be as early as 4 or 5 days earlier than average. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final question, member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the Peel River is clear. There's no debris on the rivers. Will the minister and the department put the Abraham Francis in first before the Lewis Cardinal? Just because there's a lot of people, as I say, the community is almost out of gasoline. We only have one supplier left in the community, and people want to restock their supplies as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As this whole House knows, the traveling public and safety is number one for us. I'll have to confirm with our staff where we're at on both these ferries and get back to the member. But, you know, as we've updated this House in previous years going forward, the general public and the members of this Assembly need to be well aware that the river conditions can change drastically. We've had low water already this year, but due to spring melt coming out of the mountains, things can change because that's, as last year, it caused problems, particularly in Fort McPherson because of all the debris that was coming down and washing out the approaches. But this is something that we'll continue to monitor and to relate to the general public, and I will keep the House informed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For over the past 3 years, I've spoken to the Minister of Infrastructures with concerns about our ferry service. In the past, we've seen lower water levels, which have caused disruption to the services. I've reached out to the Minister of Infrastructure numerous times to talk about different options, such as moving the ferry landing, look at various options across the river and potential bridge options. I realize some of these options are not feasible at this time. However, this year we are seeing lower water levels already, a very different breakup, and we could be seeing ourselves in deeper troubles this year. Therefore, I'd like to revisit this issue with the Minister of Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister be willing to approach the Canadian Coast Guard to come to Fort Simpson and survey the area around the Fort Simpson landing and alternate routes there? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly will contact the responsible authority who can accurately survey the river. We can do that around the ferry landings and possible alternative routes. As I've said in my previous comments here with the Fort McPherson ferry, low water is going to be an issue. We know that already, the way things are looking. And the one thing about the Fort Simpson ferry and that crossing, there's so much silt and gravel in that thing that the conditions can change on a regular basis there and on a very short period of time. So, and there's also the gravel bar issue that's in the middle of the river there as part of our navigational issues, and usually in the fall time, and that could be something that we may experience earlier in this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions, Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Minister, and first of all, I have to thank the department and the staff for doing a great job for getting the ferry on the 15 average. So, you know, the 15-year average was the day we actually got in there, even with all these difficulties, so I thank him. And realizing the problems about the, you know, silt and gravel, but has the Minister looked at the feasibility of dredging the area causing these problems for the ferry? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With respect to dredging, and waterworks are extremely difficult to get approvals for. We know that. The current amount of debris and silt, as I said, that are in the river carries are being advised that any dredging operation be a minimal value. I think I've mentioned that in this House before. For those of you that have been on the Liard Ferry in the summertime, it's a very dirty river, and dredging might be a very minimal value doing that. We do know that the low water in the channel that we used last fall, as I said, with that gravel bar prevents a problem. Dredging may be an option, and we will continue to look at what our options are going to be going forward this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And listening to the Minister, he's talked about, and I think the department's looking at the challenges we're facing, so I thank them for that. So has the department looked at this situation to come up with various options, and can he talk about some of them here today? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, he's asked me this question before in the House, and you know, with climate change in effect, and we're monitoring these things very closely, we're looking at all options up and downstream, particularly at Fort Simpson right now, but being the fiscal situation we're in, if I had the required funding, we could probably pursue some of these things, but I think we're going to have to continue to monitor the situation and look at all options going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Final oral question, Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I realize we're in, you know, financial difficulties and that, and we're seeing some of the challenges. So will the Minister commit to have his staff reach out to the leadership and actually have a public meeting to discuss some of these options and hear the concerns from the residents so we can move forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our regional staff in the area are always prepared to meet with the leadership in the community, and if that is the desire of the community, they can certainly have the member send me a request for that, and we can have our regional staff sit down and discuss options and hear their concerns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister responsible for the Housing Corporation. Let's start with the plan for spending the new National Housing Strategy money. When will that plan be available to the public? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as committee is well aware of, we have had discussions in committee on where we are with this funding. We are developing a 3-year action plan, and we did say and committed that we would share that action plan with the committee. We can work on providing where we are with that action plan and the partnerships that we have with CMHC. But as members are aware and as committees aware that we did have some committee members come to Inuvik for the Housing Summit, and that we did also hear other innovative ideas and other ways that we can address the housing issue in the Northwest Territories. So we will look at working with the committee and give an update once this 3-year action plan has been approved by the federal government, and we'll share the final action plan with committee. And I think it's something that's going to be very important transitioning into the next government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I didn't hear any timing around that, but I heard some process responses. As we come to the end of this assembly, my question for the Minister is whether any of the public housing waiting lists are shorter now than they were 3 years ago, and whether over these last 4 years there's been any increase in the uptake in home ownership. Merci.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member knows, and we did have a chat a little bit earlier, there has been an increase in terms of public housing. It could be due to the economy, you don't know. But I know that people that go into market rental units do have to get on the waiting list for housing. We can get that information and share it with the member, share it with committee, so that we can look at how we can address the issues. One positive thing, Mr. Speaker, is that we are doing these community housing plans, and to look at the priorities for each community across the Northwest Territories. But as the member noted in her statement, she did also talk about the Community Housing Support Initiative, the flexibility that we have around that program, and I do encourage all leadership, all groups that want to work on addressing housing issues in their community to reach out to us at the N.W.T. Housing Corporation and come up with a plan. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a previous plan called Toward Level Ground set targets for the Housing Corporation to assist people with housing issues. The goal was to help 1,077 households and spend $67 million. This plan is now in year 3 of 3. Can the minister tell us whether this plan is going to meet those goals? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The action plan in the document Toward Level Ground lists a number of housing programs and initiatives that I've brought up, that previous housing ministers have brought up during the life of this government to address the housing issues. We continue to work on that. We want to create partnerships with other leadership across the territories and our stakeholders and NGOs, and the N.W.T. has made a commitment to assist 250 core need households every year during this period. We have been meeting those targets, and we have been giving that information to committee, and we'll continue to do that work, and we'll continue to keep committee members of this government apprised of how we are addressing the housing issues across the Northwest Territories. And I'll repeat it again, Mr. Speaker, those community housing plans and putting some of the onus and the accountability on our leadership and our community members to address that and work together is something that we can look forward to, and obviously the funding that we've been able to get from the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his response. I look forward to some more detailed information about how the targets set in the Toward Level Ground report or plan have been met, because the Minister's math and the numbers set out in the plan don't match. So I'm hoping that now that this program is in year 3 of 3, that he will be able to do some detailed reporting on the first 2 years. When can we expect that report? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know we've been making some good changes within the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. That data we will get for the member, and we'll actually share it with standing committee, as well as I think it's something that we need to share right across the board. The housing summit that we just held in late April is something that was also brought up, and we really need to share and develop partnerships with our leadership in the communities and see how we can address the issues. So we will get that information, that data, and share it with the member committee. Like I said, actually all members and leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tuneta-Willowday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my statement, I spoke about of divestment of public housing by the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. Along that line, I have questions for the Minister of Housing. Mr. Speaker, for planning purposes, will the Minister get the N.W.T. Housing Corporation to look at all the public housing tenants to see how many of them are paying rent in the 2 top bands that's provided to the authorities for rent amounts? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Housing.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, from data that we have compiled since January, there's approximately 270 households making over a significant amount of money, about $5,000 a month. Our local housing organizations are working with some of these owners to look at, with the ones that are in higher incomes, to explore home ownership and support options with our department to see how we can address those. On the other note, we do have a unit disposal plan where we are where we have sold about 20 units in 2018-19. We've also demolished 20 units across the territory where we can build new units so other people, whether it's public housing that needs to be addressed. So we are on a plan, and we're continuing to work diligently on addressing the issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Tuneta-Willowday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister agree to share that plan with us, and the plan that looks like the Minister is looking at divesting public housing, which I think is the right direction to go. I'd like to ask the Minister to be prepared to share that plan with us, indicating how many units that the Housing Corporation could probably divest itself up. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since April 1st, 2016, we've been working on trying to make a commitment to dispose of 150 units. Currently, to date, we've disposed of 183 surplus units through a combination of sales, getting people into home ownership or lease to own, also through demolition. That's something that we're going to continue to work on with feedback from communities and with working with the standing committee. We'll continue to do that work. As I mentioned, the community housing plans is something that is unique, and I think when we work with leadership and community members, communities, that they can tell us what their priorities in terms of housing are, and we'll address that through the disposal unit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Tuneta-Williday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I first spoke of the community housing development plans. I add one word in there that's slightly different than what the government's doing development. In this House about 10 years ago, can the minister advise how many of these plans, whether they're called community housing plans or community development housing plans, exist today across the territory? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last session that we had, we did have a similar question, and I did mention that we had six communities that we were looking forward to developing community housing plans across the Northwest Territory. Set that as a goal for our first year. Since we've had the housing summit, since we've been reaching out to leaders across the territory, we have about 10 community housing plans in place, and we'll continue to work with our leadership, our community NGOs, and I'll continue to encourage our leadership across the N.W.T, whether it's NGOs or whether it's mayors and chiefs, that they reach out to the N.W.T Housing Corporation and work on setting up a community housing plan so that we know how to invest the dollars rather than us telling them what they need. They tell us, and we'll invest the funding that we've received from the federal government and the work that we've been doing there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good.
Thank you. Final oral question, member for Tuneta-Williday.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, can the minister advise if he can provide incorporate divestment plan community by community in these community development plans? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we did make a commitment that we look at trying to demolish and sell units, about 50 a year, and we're reaching and going over those targets. And as we develop these community plans with leadership and people in the community, that's something that we're going to have to address. We don't want to be the ones that tell people or communities what they need and what they want. It's got to be a responsibility between leadership from the communities and us, and working together to, as I mentioned, address the housing priorities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we will be making that something that as a priority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my member's statement, the prices, as of April 1st, the prices of beer for licensees in the city of Yellowknife increased dramatically. For draft beer, it was around 10 to 18%, bottled beer 20%, and wine 6%. These are significant costs to their businesses and their ability to maintain a viable business without passing on too many costs to the consumer. These are far ahead of what was advertised by the N.W.T Liquor Commission, who said the prices would be modest. Can the minister responsible for the commission respond to what caused these price increases clearly on the public record? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to see the member advocating for, even though he said it's not lower prices for alcohol in the Northwest Territory, knowing the effect that alcohol has on the people in Northwest Territories. Terminating the contract with the liquor warehouse did result in lower price, lower cost to consumers at the liquor stores, and there was an unintended consequence of leveling the cost structure for liquor stores and licensee was a significant increase to licensees in Yellowknife. We miss that, and as Minister, I take responsibility for that. It has been addressed, and members well aware of how it's been addressed because we communicated that to him through a discount program, and then that discount program is throughout the Northwest Territories, not just Yellowknife. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm a bit confused. The minister mentioned that the goal here is not to lower the price of alcohol, and yet it seems like that's what was achieved while the price, as an unintended consequence, went up. So, can the minister clarify what was the price decrease for consumers as a result of this change? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Well, there was a price decrease to consumers because through the discount program, the licensees were actually paying a lesser price, and they were able to then pass along those savings to the consumers. I mean, I have the numbers here. We could, I could look at possibly, I'm not sure how. I could look at possibly putting these on the website so they know exactly what the prices went down to. I mean, it's right in my briefing book. The license holders paid 8.3% less for spirits, 6.1% less for wine. Then they did pay a bit more for for canned and bottled beer because I think it's costed on a volume basis. So we've taken steps to ensure that the licensees didn't feel the brunt of it as much as they may have, which was unintended. But we did, through this particular initiative, in not renewing the contract, I believe we reduced about $1.2 million in inventory that was held at the warehouse. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this information is important for the public to know. It's yet to be fully explained. So, can the minister commit to publicizing the full extent of this information, the total price increases, the total price decreases after the subsidy program, and how the subsidy program is going to work to benefit the hospitality industry in Yellowknife and throughout the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I will look at possibly doing this if I'm able to make that public to the 1% that are quite interested in it, and the other 99% are wondering why we're lowering the price to knowing that the effect it's having on people in Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final oral question, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the minister has made this choice when his personal feelings are quite differently, but our hospitality industry is not about liquor, it's about jobs, it's about business opportunities in the capital and throughout the Northwest Territories. And if we're going to support tourism and other opportunities, we need to support it as well. There's been calls to reform Canada's antiquated liquor systems. Ontario is moving towards a major reform of policy. There seems to be some interest on the ground from at least my constituents and the people I've spoke to. Will the minister, in undertaking the price evaluation, look to consulting with folks on how we can modernize our liquor system, ensure that it is fair, competitive, and offers consumers more choice? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, personal feelings aside, I think the department has done a good job in trying to mitigate the impact that it was going to have on licensees, and I think we've done that. And I have committed to, I've asked the department to do a whole pricing policy review, and there's a number of other things that we may need to do. But no, I fully understand and I fully respect the impact that it might have on business in Northwest Territories. I'm not blind to that fact. And we try to do what we can to have a balance here between the needs of the business in Northwest Territories. And I think we've addressed that. And if I'm able to, I will make some of the information that we provided along public so people will know that we have taken steps to ensure that the licensees are protected in this as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My statement earlier today outlined the sequence of providing airline passengers with crucial information regarding flight check-in times at the Yellowknife Airport. I've given the Minister advance warning of my questions today, so I wonder if he could first tell me how far in advance did the Yellowknife Airport managers know about the renovations in the baggage area, and how long were they told the renovations would take to complete? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I have the notes here. Thank you, the member, for giving us the heads up on this. I'm going to take the opportunity to actually let the public know what are we actually doing out there. And these renovations are part of a larger project. The Holds baggage screening recapitalization, which is funded by CATSA, which is the Canadian Air Transportation Security Authority. The funding was approved in December of 2018. The contract for the building modifications included the renovations to the oversized screening area, to level 2 and level 3 screening areas. And for those of you that don't know, that's located behind the check-in counters. Currently, the contractor is working to complete the first phase. This required temporary shutdown of baggage handling system to check baggage for flights. The public communication about the impact to the traveling public began prior to the project starting, and it was communicated that the public should arrive 90 minutes in advance for a few weeks until the end of May, and we've been working closely with the contractor to have this first phase finished as soon as possible, and we are on target to have it completed by the end of May. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. So the funding came through in December, and the news release for from the department went out on May the 10th, 10 days after the work was already started. So I think the Minister would agree that it's a pretty big deal missing your flight because you arrived too late at the airport, and I understand the Minister has some personal experience with this. So, so I hope that we would all agree that a comprehensive multimedia awareness campaign alerting the public to these facts is very important to convey to air travelers in Yellowknife. So can the Minister explain why there was no comprehensive communications campaign about the need to come to the airport at least 30 minutes in advance of the 60-minute check-in time? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think the House will be very surprised on what we've done here. There were several communication tactics used to notify the public in advance, and I'll be very specific. Radio ads ran from April 24th to May 10th. That's radio ads. There were 2 newspaper ads, April 24th and May 3rd. Posters were distributed to local businesses within the community, alerting the traveling public about the situation. Several tweets were issued in the days leading up to the start of construction, and a public announcement was issued later to confirm the status and estimated completion dates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that detailed information. I guess I missed the ad on April the 24th, but the news release from the department, not everybody tweets, not everybody has access to the internet. The news release only went out on May the 10th, 10 days after the work was already started. So can the Minister tell us when this work is going to be completed at the airport and how many people have missed their flights as a result of this work? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, currently Phase 1 is scheduled to be completed by end of May. That's Phase 1. And we'll be notifying the public when we do the other stuff. Neither the Yellowknife Airport nor the Department of Infrastructure has received any complaints on this matter. We are not aware of any flights being delayed or any passengers that have missed their flights. Travelers have cooperated and have been arriving early to avoid congestion, and we've been monitoring the passenger flow, and interim system has been functioning well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final oral question, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that information. I mentioned that there's no notice of the extra time for check-in on the Yellowknife Airport Authority website, and there doesn't seem to be much collaboration with airline partners because there's no information that I can find on their websites about the need for an early check-in. So can the Minister tell us how the department would improve its communications next time around regarding planned construction delays at the Yellowknife Airport? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Speaker, as I've said, this is only the first stage of a larger CATSA project. We can take some lessons learned from this. Even the email that I've sent out to all members stating what was going on there, we'll make sure that that gets out there before we start these things. I think I'll have to double check though for the member, but I think when you actually book your ticket, they actually notify you, the airlines notify you what's going on at the airport. I'll have to check into that, but I've been informed I think that is the possibility of what's going on when you book your ticket. But you know, communications has always been an issue in this legislative assembly, and we continue to strive to make things better. We realize not everybody is on Twitter or on Facebook or reads the newspaper, which makes things difficult, but we'll try to do our best to communicate well in advance of what we can do coming up with the next CATSA projects. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to my questions here is directed to the Minister of Infrastructure. As mentioned in my statement here, the Department of Infrastructure and the Satu Secretariat Incorporated achieved a signing of the Memorandum of Understanding to undertake jointly the environmental assessment and in the process the establishment of a working group. My first question to the Minister, would the Minister support a youth appointment to the working group? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOU that was signed between SSI and ourselves, the Satu Secretariat, was intended to formalize the working relationship between parties on the advancement of the Mackenzie Valley Highway through the environmental and regulatory reviews. The MOU provides for the creation of a working group with members of working group to be appointed by the SSI and the Government of the Northwest Territories Department of Infrastructure. Each party to the MOU is responsible for selecting its own members to the working group. SSI is responsible for appointing its own members to the working group, which could include a youth member if they wish. But in addition, the MOU, under the MOU, SSA may also designate other SAT2 organizations to work with infrastructure to complete the required work on specific topics such as social economic studies. The SSI could consider youth issues and youth involvement in selecting these designated organizations and members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad for that reply. It seems to be going in the direction of transferring knowledge through experience, and it would be just, I would say, a huge experience if youth could actually participate with feet on the ground here with the working group to engage community sessions during the environmental assessment. My next question there, Mr. Speaker, would the Minister undertake working cost options with the Minister of Youth for this position? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister responsible, I would be working with all my Cabinet colleagues to strive to advance the Mackenzie Valley Highway environmental assessment. But as part of that, the Government of the Northwest Territories' internal efforts to organize itself and move this project forward, the N.W.T working groups will be created and led by infrastructure to address specific issues. These working groups will consist of our government staff and from various departments, of course, and agencies, and it is expected that youth issues will be addressed by the appropriate working groups. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister send me an email to the options that are available in both of my previous questions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister of Infrastructure.
Certainly, I can follow up with that, and I'd like to add one more comment, I guess, because it's up to the SSI if they want to have youth involvement to him, and myself, I can reach out to the SSI leadership and have these discussions and possibilities of having youth involvement in this, and I encourage the member and all members to encourage the SSI leadership maybe to include future leadership people or youth people that want to be involved in this thing going forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final oral question, member for Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is really not a question, but a note for the Minister to collaborate in future actions here. I think it would be very promising on behalf of this government, as the proponent and the applicant to that section of infrastructure down the corridor, to actually send the message to the communities on engagement that we do have a youth at the table. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Comment from the member. Let's try and keep question period to questions. Next, I have the member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I have a few more questions for the Minister responsible for the Housing Corporation. I was interested to hear him tell my colleague, Mr. Bolio, that the Housing Corporation had divested of 183 units in the last 3 years. Could the Minister tell us, even in general terms, how many of those units were sold to homeowners and how many of them were demolished? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll have to get back to the member on the detail because I did mention that since April 1st, 2016, there has been 183 units that we demolished or sold. The detail that I can give the member at this moment is that during 2018, 2019, we did sell 20 units and we demolished 20 more. And we are still continuing to work with communities and working with our residents in terms of finding ways that we can get them into a home ownership program or lease-to-own program. I can get that detail from the Housing Corporation, and I'll share it with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the detail the Minister was able to provide. I think that he would agree with the statement that with a waiting list of over 900 households, removing 20, bringing 20 more units into circulation while is some progress, is clearly not enough progress. Consistently, there's been a low uptake on housing for several reasons. A new one that I learned about at the Housing Summit is the high cost of insurance. Apparently, insurance companies are reluctant to insure homes in communities without fire departments and/or hydrants. So my question for the Minister then, is there anything the Housing Corporation can do to help potential homeowners with the cost of insurance? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned, I was really appreciative that Standing Committee was able to attend the Housing Summit in Inuvik and listen to some of the concerns that were brought up, whether it was by industry, whether it was by leadership, or whether it was by non-government organizations. And we do know that accessing home insurance can be challenging and very costly in some of our communities. However, I'd just like the members and residents and our groups to know that insurance costs are established by insurance providers, and we do not have the ability to adjust those rates, Mr. Speaker. However, as noted in Inuvik, we will do some thorough research and look at the options that might be available to us and the resulting financial costs moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that insurance rates are set by the insurance industry, but one possibility I would like to bring to the Minister's attention is a self-insurance scheme where the insurance is provided by the Government of the Northwest Territories to the homeowners so that it is more affordable to them and it meets the goal of moving people who can afford to get out of public housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
As I mentioned in the last answer, that we are going to look at and do some research on the options that would be available. And once we look at those options and do the research, that we would share it with the standing committee, we'd share it with members. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Final oral question, member for Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, once again, I hope that the research will include a self-insurance option. And could the minister tell us when we can see the results of this research? When does he plan to have that completed? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister responsible for the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I don't have a timeline. Coming out of the Housing Summit, we are developing a report that we're going to share with our leadership, that we're going to share with our stakeholders, that we are going to work with people that came to the Housing Summit. So that's a priority, just to make sure that everything that came out of that Housing Summit, where we had leaders from 24 of our communities across the Northwest Territories, and we want to make sure that we know what the next steps are. So at this moment, we don't have a timeline, but we will look into that research. That's something that we are committed to, but our staff also needs to work on developing the programs and promote the programs. And as I mentioned, our community housing plans, we had 3, or actually we had 6 as a goal, and now we have 10 communities that we're working with. And after the summit, I'm sure we're going to be expecting more communities come and reach out to the Housing Corporation to do more work. So once we get that information, we'll share it with standing committee and members. But right now, I don't have a timeline. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 15-18-3 asked by the member for Frame Lake on February 5th, 2019 to the Honourable Premier related to the Government of the Northwest Territories' participation in the Association for Mineral Exploration Roundup in January 2019. Mr. Speaker, I have a return to written question 16-18-3 asked by the member for Cam Lake on February 26, 2019 to the Minister responsible for the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission regarding the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission rates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Replies to the Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to report to the Assembly that the Standing Committee on Government Operations has reviewed Bill 29, an act to amend the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and that Bill 29 is now ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Infrastructure.
I wish to table the following 4 documents entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 502-18-3 Avalon Nachalacho Rare Earth Elements Project. Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 567-18-3 Ice Bridges and Roadside Assistance. Follow-up letter for oral question 650-18-3 Sax Harbor Power Generation, and follow-up letter for oral question 670-18-3 Significant Discovery Licenses. On behalf of the Minister of Health and Social Services, I wish to table the following 8 documents entitled Follow-up letter for oral questions 574-18-3 Mental Health Services Wait Time. Follow-up letter for oral questions 588-18-3 Dental Services in Small Communities. Follow-up letter for oral question 600-18-3 Regional Wellness Councils. Follow-up letter for oral questions 612-18-3 Yellowknife Audit Day Programming. Follow-up letter for oral questions 628-18-3 Stanton Hospital Transition. Follow-up letter for oral questions 636-18-3 Meals Vaccine. Follow-up letter for oral questions 661-18-3 Caring for Elders and Communities. and follow-up letter for oral questions 681-18, bracket 3, medical traveling abroad home concerns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister, tabling of documents. Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 570-18 in brackets 3 Supreme Court of Canada Redwater Decision and Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 651-18 in brackets 3 Equity Leases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 5 documents entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 511-18, bracket 3, Consultation on the Bathurst Caribou Herd, Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 520-18, bracket 3, Consultation on the Sugar Sweetened Drink Tax, Follow-up Letter to Oral Question 524-18, bracket 3, Indigenous Training Program, Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 625-18, bracket 3, Cleacho All-Season Road Costs, and Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 647-18, bracket 3, Developing a Knowledge Economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Tabling of documents. Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following 4 documents entitled Follow-up Letter to Oral Questions 547-18, brackets 3, Sexual Abuse in Amateur Sport. Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 629-18, brackets 3, Heating Issues at the Joe Greenland Centre. Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 686-18, brackets 3, Northwest Territories Consumer Rights and Protections. And follow-up letter for Oral Question 697-18, brackets 3, Northwest Territories and Nunavut Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter for Oral Question 562-18, brackets 3, Recruitment Process for Associate Deputy Minister of Post-Secondary Education Renewal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following document. It's a letter dated April 25th, 2019 from the Giant Mine Oversight Board to Crown Indigenous Relations Northern Affairs Canada regarding observations on Measure 6, evaluation of long-term funding options. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in Committee of the Whole, bills and other matters, with the member for Mackenzie Delta in the chair.
Thank you, Committee. Committee, I'll now call the Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Beaulieu.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee wishes to consider Minister Statement 131-18's bracket 3 sessional statement.
Thank you. Committee, we have agreed to consider Member Statement 131-18 brackets 3 sessional statement. I will now open the floor to comments on Member Statement 131-18 brackets 3 sessional statement. See no comments. Is committee agreed that you have concluded consideration of Member Statement 131-18 brackets 3, sessional statement. Agreed. Thank you, committee. We have concluded consideration of Member Statement 131-18 brackets 3, sessional statement. Mr. Bolio. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order and is non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Any abstentions? The motion is carried, and I will now rise and report progress. Thank you, committee.
Report of Committee of the Whole, member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister's Statement 131-18 brackets 3 sessional statement, and would like to report that Minister's Statement 131-18 brackets 3 is concluded. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you.
Thank you, member. There's a motion on the floor. All those in favor? All those opposed? Can I get a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day. Mr. Clerk.
Orders of the day for Friday, May 24th, 2019, 10 a.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to commissioners' opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, second reading of bills, consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters, bills 26 and 30, committee report 15-18.3, minister statement 151-18.3, minister statement 158-18.3, report of committee of the whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Friday, May 24th, 2019 at 10 a.m.